Hello and welcome everyone to another WCS Talks virtual happy hour. I'm your moderator for today's event, Lisa Ann Pinkerton, founder and chairwoman of Women in Cleantech and Sustainability and founder and CEO of Technica Communications. We have a few logistics and opening remarks that we want to go through before we get to our speaker from Opus 12. So right away, here's our agenda. We're going to talk right now, housekeeping and arrivals. Then Heidi will give her talk about carbon utilization. And then we'll have two breakout sessions where you can network with each other. And then we'll also have a moment where we come back and talk about what we discussed in our breakout rooms. And by 6:15, we should all be wrapped up. And that is our agenda. You can see here we have some breakout room questions, icebreakers for you, and those questions will also be added into the chat right before the networking begins. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. If you're not aware, we are an international women's organization focused on providing educational opportunities and mentorship to women and men in the clean tech and sustainability space. We work to have multiple events a month. We're all virtual right now, obviously. We do mentorship, and we also have a very popular TED-style conference that Google hosts every year. So if you're curious about learning more about what we do, we're here to hang out with you. You just come in to our website and join us. Next slide, please. Some quick Zoom etiquette and virtual networking. This slide was incredibly helpful at the beginning of the pandemic. Now I think we all pretty much know the drill, but please mute yourself appropriately, and also share your full name in your on your video so that we can find you on LinkedIn and speak to you with your proper name and the networking opportunities that are coming up. Also, we encourage you to put your LinkedIn profile in the chat. That way we can all link in with each other and continue the networking outside of this meeting. This meeting is to connect you all, but the real networking begins outside of this meeting because we only have a few short 15-minute breakout sessions to actually do the networking here in the event. Next slide, please. We do have a virtual membership. If you're interested, here are some of the benefits, and you can email membership at womencleantechandsustainability.org. If you would like to join us, we will reimburse you for the cost of this event here today. So please take us up on that offer if you're looking to gain free access to our events and our networking. Next slide, please. Like I said, my name's Lisa Ann Pinkerton, and I won't introduce myself again. I'm your moderator. And so we'll go to the next slide. Wanted to take a moment to thank our volunteers before we get to our speaker. This event would not be happening without all of the people listed here participating on a volunteer level, giving of their time and sharing their passions with us to organize this event and make it a success. So we want to thank everybody on this page, especially our event organizers and our Zoom producers who are here running the show on the back end, and all of the facilitators who are going to make those breakout room sessions much easier. All right, next slide. I want to turn it over to YPE, who are our co-hosts for this event, and let them give you a little feeling for what their organization is all about.
Thanks, Lisa Ann. So hi, everyone. I'm Missa San Gimino. I serve on the board of YPE NYC, which is the New York chapter of Young Professionals in Energy. So YPE is a nonprofit organization with more than 50, I think now 50,000 members across 40 different chapters. And we provide a forum for energy professionals to network, learn, grow in the sector, and generally host educational and community events. So you'll hear from YPE NYC and YPE San Francisco Bay Area today. Yeah, you'll see we have a lot of awesome events coming up that we'll talk about a little bit at the end. But yeah, follow us on social media, sign up for our mailing list, and really looking forward to this event.
Thank you very much, Missa, and thank you for helping us organize this event. You're a rock star. All right, our speaker is Heidi Lim. She is the Chief of Staff for Opus 12, and she is going to walk us through some high-level concepts related to carbon sequestration, removal, restoration. I mean, there's a lot going on in this space, and I think for a lot of us, it's on the periphery of our experience, and many of us probably haven't dug in really deep into this very quickly emerging market and industry. So Heidi is here to give us the 411 and help us to understand a little bit more about it. I also want to point you all to an article that she wrote. It's posted on Medium, and Abigail is going to post it here in the chat for you. It's a very comprehensive article about all the different types of technologies that can be employed here, and it's a really good read, so highly recommend it. Heidi, are you ready to give your talk?
Yes.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We can go back just a second if you don't mind. I'm going to just to introduce myself. So Heidi Lim, I use she and her pronouns. I appreciate YPE and WCS for having me today. And I'm very excited anytime I get a chance to talk to Cleantech folks about carbon removal, because it is an emerging but very important pathway that we need to also pay attention to get to our climate goals. So I'll start with today just to share with you why I care about climate change. And I was thinking today that it would be also a nice pause to for us all to think about why we care about climate, why we're here today. You know, I want to work towards a world where people can live in the communities that they want to and feel safe and secure, no matter what that means. I think that's the very basic reason why I care about climate change. And in order to do that, a few years ago, I was working in a software company, and I was going home every day thinking about climate and thinking about the environment and clean tech, and wanting to be with folks like you, thinking about your full-time work actually being devoted to addressing climate change. And so during that time, I was in a job transition from software into climate, and I decided I wanted to do a lot of research about what can I do uniquely, like where should I be placing my efforts. And there just became a recurring theme that there's a thing called carbon removal that was extremely important to address climate change beyond what we are typically used to talking about when talking about clean tech. So that's what we're going to discuss today. All right, thank you. We can go to the next slide. So there were two things that stood out to me while I was in my own personal journey that I kept thinking about. So every year, humans add about 40 gigatons of CO2 to the atmosphere every single year. And it's increasing because, you know, we continue to go down this continued trajectory. On top of that, CO2 actually lives in the atmosphere for up to hundreds of thousands of years. So what this means, on the next slide, is that there's a lot of CO2 that's still in the atmosphere. So since the Industrial Revolution, all of the CO2 we've ever put in the atmosphere, 40% of that is still there because of this long-term persistence of carbon. So, and by the way, about 60% of that was about equally absorbed by natural carbon sinks, which is the oceans and the land, so primarily plants and trees. So that means that it is actually not enough to just reduce the emissions we're putting up into the atmosphere. So, but usually when you go up to somebody and you ask them, you know, even if you're talking to somebody in the clean industry, you ask like, how do we deal with climate change? Well, often, as you'll see in the next slide, you'll hear them say things like, we can electrify the grid, which is great. We should electrify our vehicles. We should switch to a plant-based diet. And these are all important, but they all go into the category of reducing emissions. But once again, we need to do more than that. And even the IPCC has stated as much that if we want to avoid 5 or 2 degrees or more Celsius increase of global temperatures, we have to have what I call carbon removal, but it's also been called negative emissions, which is to clean up what is already up in the atmosphere, this carbon surplus. So that's where carbon removal comes in. So I only have 15 minutes and I was asked to talk about my work at Opus 12. So I haven't, I'm not going to be going too deep into what carbon removal is, but it is essentially all the things we can do to remove atmospheric CO2. So broadly, I put it into two categories. It's natural solutions and technology solutions. Natural solutions are enhancing the uptake of CO2 into natural sinks. So we just talked about forests, for instance. So we can plant more trees. That's the most common thing that I think most people think about. But we can also do things like switch to regenerative agriculture, which encourages more carbon uptake and carbon retention in farmland. We could do things like introduce forests into farmland, for instance. We could do things with the ocean as well. So there's a lot of stuff in that side. And then there's the technology side. We can make machines that take up CO2 from the atmosphere and either do stuff with it or we can sequester it. You all have probably heard of direct air capture, which is like the sexy gateway drug for carbon removal because it has gotten so much attention. I think it really captures the imagination to imagine that you could create these huge fans that suck up CO2 and then you can like do stuff with it. So that's like my super short version of what carbon removal is. But it's also a primer for if you want to go dig in deeper, please go check out my article that was shared in the chat because I go very far into it. I also have citations and I expect that there are probably some nerds in this group who are interested in digging deep. So yeah, check it out. So as I was doing my research, there were a few things that were kind of themes of what we need to do. And one of the major themes for me is that we need more incentives to remove CO2. Right now, we don't have a lot of great incentives. We also need more disincentives to release it freely. And in the absence of a carbon tax or some other kind of governmental regulation, which we don't have now really in the States, that option seems pretty limited and dependent on regulated bodies. What we can do is create more reasons to take CO2 and do it through finding new ways to use the CO2 and make interesting products out of it. So, and by the way, most CO2 today, the biggest use case for CO2 is for enhanced oil recovery, whereby millions of tons of CO2, which typically today is mined from natural reservoirs, not from the air, and they pump it into existing oil reserves to push out the last part of oil, sort of like, push like blowing into a straw. That's what we use most of our CO2 for. And that's not going to get us anywhere if we really want to address emissions. So we need more reasons to take the CO2 out of the air. So that's how I got to Opus 12, which is the company I'm the staff at now. I think on the next slide we get to an Opus 12 slide. Oh, yeah. Okay. The last thing is there are a lot of industries that are hard to decarbonize. About 10 gigatons of our emissions every year are related to like cement and steel and plastics and aviation, things that are hard to defossilize just by going to electric, by going to solar and wind. So this is a separate issue that we want to address as well. Another reason why we need ways to take that CO2 from those emission sources and do something with it and make that attractive. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, we could skip this for the sake of time. It's an IPCC diagram showing that we need these net negative emissions to fully address our climate goals. All right. So I'm the chief of staff at a company called Opus 12. This is where I ended up landing after doing my full kind of soul searching, career search. And it was always at the top 3 of the companies that I was interested in. Like to me, it was direct air capture plus Opus 12. And those are really interesting to me because essentially our technology creates this pathway, a way to turn CO2 into chemical building blocks for chemicals, for materials, for fuels. It's answering the question of how do you electrify the chemicals and material space? And even how do you electrify long-haul aviation? Like any kind of fuel for something like for a flight across the Atlantic, is impossible to do with a battery, but you can charge molecules, and that's essentially what we're doing. So at a very high level, our technology takes CO2 and water as inputs, and then we use renewable energy to split up those molecules and rearrange them in the presence of a novel metal catalyst membrane. And depending on the catalyst that we use, we can make different types of chemical building blocks. So we're basically making stuff that today is made from fossil fuels, but we're making it, we're getting the carbons from CO2 instead of getting it from fossil fuels. So we can go to the next slide. So with our technology, we see an opportunity to turn 2 to 3 gigatons or 2 to 3 billion tons of CO2 into products that are about a $300–400 billion petrochemical sector today. And you're probably using some of those right now. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So you can think about, if you go to the next slide, another way to think about what we're doing is industrial photosynthesis. So we're doing exactly what plants do, but we're doing it kind of at a hyper speed. So these are our 3 founders. I'm not one of them. It's Dr. Kendra Kuhl, Dr. Itasha Cave, and Nicholas Flanders. Kendra and Itasha were at Stanford, and they were doing this really important research on using CO2 electric catalysis to make these new chemical products. They discovered that there are 16 different chemicals that can be made in one step through this process, and that was the first time that anyone in academia had figured that out. And they were very climate minded. They decided they would go through the process of figuring out how did they scale it up, how do we commercialize this technology, and eventually how can we get this to an industrial scale. And I'm happy to talk about that process for them. We went through Cyclotron Road, which is now called Activate, but that was very helpful for our growth. Now we're about 40 people based in Berkeley, California, is where our facilities are, not the university, but the town. We go to the next slide, please. So yes, industrial photosynthesis, just covered this. We can go to the next slide. So the 2 chemicals that we're really focused on now are carbon monoxide. Sounds funky. I will go over that. Carbon monoxide is actually extremely important as a chemical feedstock in many industries. So materials such as polycarbonate, which is like, you can imagine like the headlights on your car, those are made from polycarbonate, and lots of other hard plastic materials. Applications are also polycarbonate. We can also make polyurethane, which is like the foam in your running shoe or the foam in a seat cushion. And then at the largest scales, we can make fuels like jet fuel. So again, solving this challenge of how do you make a carbon neutral flight? How do you create fuels without using fossil fuels? This is one big pathway to do that. And the second molecule we're focused on is ethylene, which is the basis of many plastic materials, building materials like PVC, and other kind of chemical formulations as well. We can go to the next slide. So one day you'll be able to take a carbon neutral flight across the Atlantic. You'll be able to, on that flight, wear clothing made from CO2, carrying a suitcase that is made from CO2 as well. So you can imagine there are so many things in our built environment and our regular lives that are derived from fossil fuels, so much that we don't even realize it. But we can essentially change out the source of the carbons for those. All right, next slide, please. So we think about our carbon emissions in 2 ways. Our carbon solution, rather, is that we're both converting CO2 as a feedstock. So for instance, for every 1 ton of ethylene we make, we are converting 3 tons of CO2. And we're also avoiding emissions associated with conventional production. So we're avoiding about 2 tons of CO2 for every 1 ton of ethylene produced. And this is kind of how we get to this about 10% of global CO2 emissions that we can impact. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. So our technology is actually this membrane that goes inside of an existing reactor design. So we are leveraging a water electrolyzer, something I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So we took a PEM water electrolyzer, which is a technology that's been around for decades, to make renewable hydrogen using renewable energy. And we are changing out the membrane, and a couple other things that allow us to use this type of architecture to split CO2. And this kind of foresight that the founders had about what kind of technology system to use has been very helpful. So we are able to take advantage of existing systems, and we have a partnership with one of the world's largest water electrolysis companies to build the balance of plant for our units. So right now we're at we have first commercial systems on a small scale, and we're really focused on the next year and a half or so, scaling up to our first industrial unit, which would be able to consume tons per day scale of CO2. It's a modular system, so then from then on, once we get to that size, it's a matter of scaling up through building out multiple modules, and that's how we get to hundreds or thousands of tons per day of CO2 addressed per site. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So there's a few collaborations that we've been talking about actually publicly. So one of them is that we made the first automotive part from CO2 in concert with Mercedes-Benz last year, and we announced that in Stuttgart in February. So this is the only one material that we can impact one part of a car, but electric vehicles will still have about 350 kilograms on average of plastics. They'll need a better source for getting the raw materials for those plastics. So this is the vision for Mercedes and hopefully other automotive companies as well. And we also announced a few weeks ago, we are partnering with Tide, like the detergent company, which is a Procter & Gamble product, and we're going to be making some ingredients for them from CO2. So that's another project that we're working on. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. We're also working with the Air Force to produce E-Jet, or our electric jet fuel. And this is something we're going to be making the first batch of this year, the middle of the year. So we're very excited about that. You may have heard, I think Carbon Engineering made a little bit of fuel, but this is a slightly different process and will be very exciting for us as a company. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So in closing, I just wanted to talk about where we sit. So how to think about what Opus 12 is doing. We are addressing partners and customers who are either looking to reduce a large amount of their CO2 emissions. So you see here, we just talked about steel and cement manufacturing, things like that. Direct air capture, another good source of CO2. Also addressing markets where customers need the products that we can make. So you probably see some familiar brands here that we can impact just because of the materials that they use or the different products that they are producing. And then near and dear to folks in this room, probably, we partner with companies that are looking for reasons to use more renewable energy. And so, of course, there's a lot of familiar logos here. We can take renewable energy and find new use cases for it, of course, to make higher value chemical products from CO2. And, of course, there's overlap across all of those as well. All right, well, thank you very much. Hopefully that helps to clarify a little bit about carbon removal in general, but also Opus 12 more specifically. I'm happy to, I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to answer.
Hi, Heidi. Thank you. That was very informative, very good overview, and really interesting to see what Opus 12 is up to. I think we have enough time for 2 questions, but let's keep it really tight. One is from Jake, who asks, does Opus 12's CO2 feedstock come from direct air capture systems?
So our system is agnostic to the source of the CO2. So we could connect to direct air capture systems. We can also connect to a industrial source of emissions.
Okay, very good. And then Jennifer asks, what are the byproducts of the chemical reactions needed to make the end products?
So it varies. Essentially, our system, everything that typically the whole supply chain to get to the end product stays the same, but we're changing out where the basic chemical feedstock comes from. So if there are existing byproducts that come out through that process, they probably still will exist. But I think it would depend on what we're talking about. In some cases, making things from CO2 removes some of the impurities and some of the nasty stuff that you get from having to refine oil and crude, things like that.
Okay. So in the Mercedes-Benz example, are there any byproducts there from making the plastics?
There's multiple routes to do it. There are, but again, it's like that is a general question of like how to make a plastic that is, meets environmental specifications. So yeah, there are routes to do it where the byproducts are minimized, where, the ones that you don't want will be minimized.
Okay, thank you. Well, now it's time for our networking. Thank you very much, Heidi, for your presentation. I'm sure it's going to spur a lot of very compelling conversation in our breakout rooms. So we are, let's go to the next slide.
Welcome back. Hey, is this our new breakout or is this the? No, you're back in the main hub now. Sometimes it just takes a minute for people to filter on back. Sounds good. No worries, you're in the right place. Okay. Hey everyone, welcome back. We'll just give it another few seconds for people to join us back in the main hub.
Welcome back, everybody. How was the breakout room? I don't think we need to share the screen right now. I think we could just have a look at everybody. There they are. Facilitators, would you like to share what was discussed in your breakout sessions?
Yeah, I could go really quick. Oh, sorry. So in our group, we started talking about the subject of different exciting areas that were interesting to us, like fashion and ways that more people can participate in carbon reduction. Then we kind of went in this pathway down, how do people get into this area of the clean tech industry? And there were some really interesting resources that Marissa shared, which I think are also in the general chat. But that was mainly what we talked about. It was a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, if I can add, my group, there's about 4 of us in the group, but we talked a little bit about, carbon sequestration and carbon removal technology, such as I think there's like this kind of circular economy way where you can create, bricks based out of carbon. So you can sequester or remove carbon from the atmosphere and turn those into building bricks for, building new buildings and other materials like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But I think we also came to the consensus that it's not really just solely about carbon. There's other greenhouse gases out there that are, pretty detrimental to the environment, a la, methane and different things like that. So it's just more about when we think of adaptation versus mitigation, we're kind of already at the cusp of 350 parts per million. So there's a lot to do in that sense of, are we is it an adaptation kind of issue or is it a mitigation issue with kind of reducing greenhouse gas emissions overall? So this is something to think about. And I just dropped the link in the chat for what I was talking about.
Thank you very much. That's very insightful. Completely agree. It's not just about carbon. We have a lot to remove from the atmosphere, a lot of ways to change for the better. Any other facilitators would you like to share what was spoken about in your room?
Yes, I like to share is we have 4 people in the room, and we're all from different background. We have one from film industry and healthcare industry, power generation, and grid, all over the place. But we all have a consensus on there are a lot of waste, just like the previous. I think it's Lai. I couldn't pronounce his name. Was saying. It's not just the carbon, it's all kind of pollutions was impact our environment. We need clean tech. And Neha has a very good point. She pointed out a lot of times it's a cost associated with the removal technology prevented us to use and apply those technologies. And all of us are very excited about the Opus 12 was doing, and we like to know more. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, sometimes I think about what Opus 12 is doing. It feels like the replicator from Star Trek, making these materials out of magic. Any other facilitators have something to share?
Sure. Yeah, just a couple of quick highlights from our group. I think all agreed that it's really exciting to see, carbon removal technology advance. Super exciting part of the industry. And in addition to all its, very impactful applications, we're also excited about carbon negative vodka that is created using recovered carbon dioxide from industrial processes. The other point we talked about is, because there's a proliferation of new technologies in the space, there is also a lot of risk. So finding capital for a lot of these companies and these technologies requires sort of longer term investment cycles than maybe typical like private equity type of approach. So something we'll have to figure out moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in because my room 4, we were also talking about how different stakeholders, can play different roles to bring these technologies into reality, and how we're focused on carbon removal, but right now a lot of the commercial solutions in carbon removal aren't quite ready yet. So the room ended before we could really think about how the different stakeholders can work together to really accelerate these young technologies into maturity. But, I think that's a great thing for everyone in this room to, really chew on.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, I think if there's no other facilitators who'd like to share, or anybody from my group who would like to share what we discussed, I'm doing enough talking here. So if anybody from my group wanted to share, that you're welcome to.
Lisa, I can jump in quickly and give an update on my group. We had a very interesting talk actually about 3 main topics. One was the limits of what reforestation can do and the need for a new technology, because that just won't make it in itself. The second topic was really about a recap of Opus 12 and their technology, and would love to learn a little bit more about the membrane technology and like also what happens in the long run in terms of maintenance. And lastly, we circled back to okay, if reforestation doesn't cut it, what are the best alternatives after that, and what does that mean? Like, how can we really be effective, cost effective, and scaling? How can we scale the process?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, it sounds like you have a good reason to follow up with Heidi after this meeting and ask her about those membranes.
Absolutely.
All righty. Well, if no one else has anything more to share, I'll send us back to our breakout rooms so that we can continue the networking. And then we'll see you back here in 15 minutes. I hope you had some fruitful discussions. We'd love to hear from the facilitators, or just anybody really from the group. Anybody can share. It doesn't have to be facilitators. They're designated to sort of take the pressure off everybody else. But if you have something you'd like to share, please feel free to chime in. We definitely want to hear what was discussed in your rooms.
I could start off, Alyssa. So in our group, we kind of talked about the importance of education. In one area, when you're dealing with your regulators that have developed a certain process for technologies that are not the most recent technologies, what you're doing can seem like a one-off approval that might not end up informing down the line how they approve other types of technologies that are similar, and educating the regulators about how your technology fits in with how they've regulated it before. And then we also talked about education in terms of just, broader base, underserved communities, voters in general, because for some of these things, especially when there's funding involved, it's going to need potentially a voter approval. We've seen this in the transportation space with new funding for public transit. It goes to a public vote. There needs to be some education about how these new technologies will benefit the most people, as well as the disadvantaged communities that tend to get disproportionately impacted by emissions and pollution.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, you're very right. I see Heidi nodding, so you're right. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I think that's a good one for my room to follow up on. We sort of flipped it around. Instead of focusing on challenges, we were thinking about opportunities and discussing how now we're seeing new climate goals across the U.S. and how the good visions in the U.S. have now inspired more commentary and better goals from the international community. And like we heard recently in India, how they were wanting the U.S. to not just hit net zero, but go into negative. And so, we were, or at least I was feeling inspired by our discussion about how, we could kind of have a space race, but for carbon removal and sustainable solutions. And, I think we got to think big like that in order to solve this massive problem.
I like that idea. And that's those types of things, those types of initiatives help people to get inspired and excited and really pay attention to strive for that kind of prize, if you will. Anyone else want to share?
Sure, I can go ahead. I had the pleasure to be in a room with John, Ellie, and Tamara, and we started with constraints and thought about that the time constraint, the cost competitiveness, and awareness is really are big drivers of our situation right now. And then we kind of transitioned into, okay, what is the role of government here on the national, but also on the international level? And that was a very interesting discussion around how can we disincentivize the use of fossil fuels and incentivize more renewables. And we finished off with a quick discussion around carbon tax and how to square that with equity. So yeah, that was a very interesting and diverse discussion that we had.
What was the conclusion on how to square carbon tax with equity?
Further research needed. The 60-second clock started ticking, and we basically came to the bottom line that it is a tricky one, but definitely a question that needs to be addressed for a successful implementation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
I can share
Anyone else?
A couple of
Yeah,
points
please.
from my group as well. So I was speaking with Johanna and Catherine. We had a great discussion, and we were talking about it from the point of view of financing projects. So a couple of key points: we think there needs to be some more government support, more capital available to make these projects bankable. And we also had an interesting discussion about business models. So we'd love to see the type of breakthroughs like PPAs and solar leasing, the way those delivery models enabled, wide scale deployment of solar PV. We'd love to see something like that, the equivalent of that in the carbon removal space. And we also see a lot of startups that are figuring out how to capture carbon and figuring out what to do with the carbon. But we would love to see some cross-industry sort of collaborations and projects to really demonstrate like the whole value chain in the carbon removal space. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, David. We have a few more minutes left, so if anybody has some burning information they'd like to share with the group, now is the time. About 5 minutes left in this meeting.
In our group,
Ying.
we have Joy, Julie, and Meredith. So one of the, in addition to similar things like other group talk, one of the things, policy, we found, I think Joy said is a carrot and a stick, both. So it's like in the past, the Clean Water, Clean Air Act, maybe similar thing can be implemented for the carbon footprint, carbon removal, and also carbon generation to the input to the environment.
Absolutely. Heidi, at Opus 12, are there any certain policies that you as a company are tracking in terms of what you think is going to work best?
Yeah, so we've been able to leverage a lot of government grants on top of private funding, and so some of you may know Itasha, or who's often going and speaking on our behalf, and often asked to talk about startups using government funding. And I see Joy from Cal Seed. So, for instance, so we've gotten a lot of support through the Department of Energy and looking at the different governmental offices, federal offices, as well as the state in California. So we look out for anything that incentivizes carbon utilization or sustainable fuels, sustainable products, and it's becoming more of a topic on the Hill, which is really great to see.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I think we're out of time. So if Tina, if you could take us to our ending slides, which some of you have already seen because we started going through those before our breakout room. So let's go back to the WCS events real quick. Waste and recycling innovations, that's coming up on the 21st, next week. And then WCS Talks Part 4 is happening on May 8th. This is normally our big TED style conference that happens every year. We broke it out into 4 parts. And there is a way for you to get a discount on that event should you choose to join us. Next slide. YPE also has some events coming up, Earth Day Trivia, and they have an event also in May called EVs Turning the Corner on EV Adoption. And that's the San Francisco chapter. Then the New York chapter has Breaking into Clean Energy. It's a careers event, Latinx Energy Career Trajectories, and Federal Energy Policy Ask Me Anything event. So those are some pretty good events too. Hope you can make the time to attend those as well. Next slide. We have a community survey that we are hoping that you wouldn't mind taking just a few minutes to fill out. And if you do so, you'll get a 25% discount to WCS Talks Part 4. And this helps us to understand you, our community, whether you're a paid member or you're a community member or you just showed up to your first event. We don't care who you are. We just want to know what is driving you to be a part of our organization, where you came from, and sort of what your aspirations are for the industry at large and our community here at WCS. And by filling this out, it helps us to understand you and better serve you. Next slide, please. And please join us in the virtual world. We all hang out on various social media platforms and would love to see you there. Big thank you to YPE and MISA and all of the volunteers for today's event. You were fantastic in running it, and we're really, really happy to work with you and happy to have you a part of the community. Hope to see you all on LinkedIn and at another event. So thank you very much for joining.